My name is Jason Howe. I'm 39 years old, a resident of Holton. I was born in Presque Isle, and I live in New Limerick now. Spent most of my life living in the greater Holton area, Hodgson, and I'm going to talk about the foundation of Baxter State Park, and a story that was passed on to me through my grandfather, and relates to the founding of the park itself, and my great-great-grandfather, a man from Patten by the name of Burton Walter Howe. Burton was born in Ashland in 1874. His father died when he was about 6 months old. He removed to Holton, and his mother remarried a McElroy, a Canadian gentleman, and they relocated to the Patten area. And Burton was a graduate of Patten Academy in 1887. Lumberman, pulp dealer, guide, real outdoorsman type. He was also, from all the records, a great storyteller, which must be something that ran in my family because my grandfather was the type that could drive up and down any local street and give you the story of almost every house, when it was built, who built it, what families have lived there. So anyway, Burton, in 1920, on a train ride to Chicago for the Republican National Convention, he was with a group of Maine delegates, including Arthur Gray Staples, who was the editor of the Lewiston Evening Journal at that time, Charles Barnes, who was a candidate for Speaker of the House for the state of Maine in the legislature. He was a Holton resident as well. Charles Hogg, editor of the Holton Times. Sam Connors was a journalist. Willis Parsons was the Fish and Game. He told lots of stories about his home around Patten and Shin Pond, and was making it sound like, as he called it, God's country. And on the way to Chicago and back, and Howe was very good friends with Percival Baxter, who at the time was still a legislator, hadn't become a Maine governor yet. So they had decided, this group of politicians and journalists decided that they wanted to climb Katahdin, and they were going to let Burton Howe handle putting the whole trip together. So he set out and made the preparations, and in August of 1920, they met at Burton Howe's house in Patten, Maine, and a group of about 12 men left on a buckboard wagon, headed up to Lunk Sioux, and took the Dudley Trail, made it up as far as Knife's Edge, crossed over. Over a 5-day period, they covered about 72 miles, this group of men. And when they came back, they all agreed that Maine needed a state park around Katahdin, and they were going to start working to put the park together and put the wheels in motion. Burton Howe ended up dying in 1922 with heart complications, and never got to see his dream of having that area around Mount Katahdin established as a state park. And it wasn't until 1936 when Baxter put the wheels in motion and renamed the North Peaks Howe Peaks, after his good friend Burton Howe. It's kind of a neat story, Sam Connors, who was the journalist for the Lewiston Evening Journal, put together a piece that was published in the 1921 In the Maine Woods, that was a guidebook that was put out by the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad each year in those times. And it details the story about how they all got together and made this climb. And Baxter had been to Katahdin before, but that was the first time that he really appreciated the beauty and what it had to offer, and they were committed to setting this land aside through numerous land purchases, and Baxter giving the land to the state of Maine and the people. I can remember as a boy making a couple trips up. I've never actually crossed the North Peaks. It's one of those things I wish I could someday, but that's not a part of the mountain that's hiked quite as much as other, going to some of the other peaks. But it's a beautiful part of Katahdin, and I've heard about some of the great views from up there. But I've never been able to go up. When Thoreau came up, he had talked about Katahdin an awful lot and its beauty. And the legislation that was put together to name the North Peaks after Benjamin Howe, part of that legislation also named the springs after Henry David Thoreau as well. So it's kind of a neat part. And it was 1936, I think that bill was passed, which would have been 14 years after Burton's death. But we still think it's kind of neat. We have a signed portrait within the family of Percival Baxter, and to my dear friend Bert W. Howe, as good of a friend as a man could have, type of thing. And it's kind of a special piece of Maine history, and especially with the park, being involved in the news a lot now. It's kind of neat to look back and remember, and it's been going on a long time. Many years, many decades, and several generations. And it's neat because when I was growing up, I didn't have bedtime stories like Three Little Pigs and that type of thing. My grandfather liked to tell me, stories of, Maine history and, ancestors to be proud of, type of things. So, in return, I can pass those stories along to my kids, and they think they're pretty neat too. So.